presidency was intended to stand above politics and function dispassionately in the public interest. But over time, most presidents have been forced to enter the nitty-gritty political world in order to build the necessary consensus to govern. We're going to profile some notable exceptions. 4 men who tried to restore an independent spirit to the office and put the national interest above the concerns of their own parties. The first was considered the deepest thinker of his generation, an idealist whose calling card was his extraordinary independence. He was our second president, John Adams.
I must be independent as long as I live. The feeling is essential to my existence.
He was a man of opposites, a brilliant and courageous visionary on one hand, vain and suspicious and irascible on the other. The roots of Adams's lonely integrity lay in his Puritan heritage in rural Massachusetts, where he grew up expecting to enter the ministry.
I was born and bred in the ancient town of Braintree, now called Quincy. There I began to love my books. I had some faculty for public speaking and determined that I should make a better lawyer than divine.
He rose to become Boston's foremost lawyer, often standing alone when necessary and taking on controversial causes. America in the 1770s consisted of 2.5 million British citizens, whose relationship to England was steadily worsening. Following the Boston Tea Party in 1773, the British shut down the port of Boston. John Adams wrote, "The die is cast."
Sink or swim, live or die, survive or perish with my country was my unalterable determination.
In June of 1774, 38-year-old Adams was elected a congressional delegate for a meeting of the 13 colonies to take place in what would become known as Independence Hall in Philadelphia.
If ever an infant country deserved to be cherished, it is America.
Converted to the patriot cause by his fiery cousin, Samuel Adams, he became one of the earliest proponents of revolution, and so tireless a worker, his contemporaries called him the Atlas of Independence. But he also made enemies. Always convinced he was right, he refused to compromise and called people fools to their faces when they disagreed with him.
I would quarrel with every individual before I would prostitute my pen. I am determined to preserve my independence even at the expense of my ambition.
I cannot really describe John Adams' personality. One would have had to feel it, to believe it. Everyone speaks of him as having been intense, contentious, didn't suffer fools gladly, had a very strong sense of his own importance and his own place in the history of the Republic. He was a man intensely conscious of his own worth, his own importance, his own society. He was a loner.
War erupted, and Adams was placed in charge of a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. But when asked to do the actual writing, he declined, claiming that his time was too valuable. And so, it was the tall, charismatic Jefferson who became the author, leaving John Adams to regret the decision for the rest of his life.
Jefferson ran away with all the glory of it.
Adams continued to work for American independence in missions to France and then England, where he helped negotiate an end to the Revolutionary War. And in 1788, after nearly a decade abroad, he finally returned to a new house in Quincy, where he planned to retire.
If it lay in my power, I would take a vow to retire to my little turnip yard and never again quit it.
Retirement didn't lie within Adams's power. For just 1 year later, he was elected the country's first vice president and was forced to leave his beloved Quincy once again. Most of Adams's 8 years serving under George Washington were spent in Philadelphia's Congress Hall, and during that time he came to detest the vice presidency.
My country has in its wisdom contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever man contrived, a mere mechanical tool to wind up the clock. But I am heir apparent, and a succession is to take place.
Adams followed George Washington. That's the most important thing that Adams did, was preside over an orderly transfer of power from the man that had first been president. And Adams, I believe, took it for granted that the authority Washington had wielded, the actual power over others, he had held in that office, came from the office. Mostly, it came from George Washington's presence in the office. Adams looked to the office to give him equivalent power, but the office didn't have it in it, not all by itself.
Though Adams retained George Washington's entire cabinet, he largely ignored them, and his superior attitude soon put him on a collision course with nearly everyone in government.
Washington saddled me with 3 secretaries who would control me, but I shall take care of that. When the people have chosen their presidents, they ought to expect they will act their own independent judgments.
As president, all too often his independence was counterproductive. When Congress met to debate whether to establish a U.S. alliance with France or England, Adams stubbornly refused to commit himself to either side.
2 parties existed in this country headed by men of the most determined ambition, the one inclined to France and the other to England. It was my destiny to run the gauntlet between these 2 factions.
John Adams wished to put himself equidistant between the Jeffersonian Democrats on the one hand and the Hamiltonian Federalists on the other. He did not cultivate support on either side. He ended with very little support from either.
Adams's presidency was consumed by an international crisis. It was triggered by France, which was harassing American ships at sea. After failed diplomatic efforts, the president pushed through the creation of a new Department of the Navy and ordered the rapid buildup of American naval forces.
An efficient preparation for war can alone ensure peace.
But as war fever raged across America, Adams reversed his initial tough position. And when most of his cabinet revolted in protest, Adams worked alone on his own plan to send a peace mission to France to prevent war from breaking out. Then he retreated to his farm in Massachusetts, where he insisted he would govern in isolation. And there he remained for the next 8 months of his presidency.
The people elected me to administer the government, it is true. And I do administer it here at Quincy.
He was really only comfortable in Quincy, Massachusetts, and maybe as far away as Boston. But for any reason, to isolate oneself politically as far as that is to risk the capacity to govern at all. That's an isolate's stand. It's a dangerous stand. To believe in independence and to act on independence is to risk isolation, and that was Adams' fate.
Toward the end of his term in office, Adams became the first president to live in the new executive mansion in the capital city of Washington. And there, the man who chose not to be a minister offered a simple prayer for future presidents.
I pray heaven to bestow the best blessings on this house and on all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
Adams finally did establish peace with France, but not in time to help restore his popularity. During his final year in office, he was publicly criticized as a man of vanity and egotism and was accused of being unfit for the office of chief executive.
It was utterly impossible that I could have lived through one more year of such labors and cares. It is a sad thing that simple integrity should have so many enemies in the world.
In 1800, Adams lost his bid for re-election to Thomas Jefferson. And on March 4, 1801, he refused to take part in his successor's inauguration. Instead, he quietly slipped out of town early that morning.
I left Washington on the 4th and arrived at Quincy on the 18th, having trotted the bogs 500 miles. I found about 100 loads of seaweed in my barnyard, and I thought I had made a good exchange. Honors and virtues for manure. I must be Farmer John and nothing more for the rest of my life.
Adams lived on for 25 more years, long enough to witness his son, John Quincy, become the country's 6th president. When a neighbor congratulated him on his son's election, he muttered, "No man who ever held the office of president would congratulate a friend on obtaining it." Towards the end, when he was described publicly as a man with few friends, the old sage became furious, but then grew wistful.
I fear the information is too true. It is impossible that any man should run such a gauntlet as I have and have many friends at the last. A man who discovers a disposition to be independent seldom succeeds.
The presidents following John Adams were far better connected to their parties, to their constituencies, and to their supporters in Congress. But in 1849, there arose to the high office a 64-year-old fighting man who was so politically inexperienced he had never even voted. He was known as Old Rough and Ready, Zachary Taylor.
On the subject of the presidency, I do not care a fig about the office. I would be as contented in a cabin as in the White House.
Zachary Taylor's crusty independence and complete lack of political skills would put him in conflict with almost everyone in government. And as had been true for Adams, Taylor's presidency offers a cautionary tale about bringing too much independence into the White House.
Zachary Taylor and John Adams superficially have very little in common. Taylor was a Southerner. He was a slave owner. He was Jefferson Davis's father-in-law. But he approached the presidency in somewhat the same way Adams had done. It was his office now. Its authority, its powers were his to exercise, regardless of party. It appeals to something Americans have always liked: the principled person standing up for his own rights. Yet, it's a luxury presidents can ill afford.
Zachary Taylor had first made a name for himself as a decisive and fearless soldier, serving in the War of 1812, then in the Second Seminole War in Florida. He became known as the finest Indian fighter in the Army, and the fairest, meticulously sticking to treaties and preventing whites from spreading into Indian lands. By 1846, near a disputed border between Texas and Mexico, American photographers captured war images for the very first time. The Mexican War was also the first time that the telegraph was used to report day-to-day battle progress to newspapers. And the American public was entranced by Zachary Taylor's decisive victories there. So much so that Taylor began being mentioned as a possible presidential candidate, even before the war ended.
My repugnance for being a candidate has been frankly made known. My thoughts are occupied in bringing this war to a speedy close.
At the White House, his sudden popularity was perceived as a political threat. President James Polk wrote, "Taylor is no doubt brave and will fight, but he is a man made giddy with the idea of the presidency. He's wholly unfit for the chief command." And in 1846, Polk transferred most of Taylor's troops to another general.
I have been stripped of nearly the whole of the regular force and more than one half of the volunteers. It seems to me the great object is to keep me as much in the dark as possible. Something is going on.
But nothing could stop Taylor from fighting. Outnumbered 4-1 at Buena Vista, Old Rough and Ready refused to surrender. And through pure grit and determination, he pulled off one of the most astonishing military victories in America's history.
I saved the administration, the national honor, and our glorious flag from being trailed in the dust.
Newspaper accounts of the stocky general who did things his own way fired the imagination of the people back home. How he wore civilian clothes and an old straw hat in action, took bullets through his sleeve, and fought on the front line alongside his men.
Zachary Taylor was a brave old feller, brigadier general, A #1, fought 20,000 Mexicanos, 4,000 he killed, the rest got and run.
And in an age when generals were more revered than politicians, Taylor was actively pursued by 3 national parties.
Zachary Taylor's bound to win.
I was nominated by Whigs, Democrats, and natives in separate meetings. I resisted them all.
Part of Taylor's appeal lay in the fact that no one knew what political party he belonged to or where he stood on any major issue.
Nearly 40 years of my life have been passed in the military, in the camp, the field, or in Indian country. I have had but little time to investigate political matters.
In November 1848, Zachary Taylor's independent spirit and ambiguous politics helped get him elected the country's 12th president.
My trials and troubles have commenced. In the discharge of my duties, my guide will be the Constitution. I hope my administration will prove beneficial.
In the White House, Taylor looked as disheveled as he had in the field. He was a confirmed tobacco chewer, and visitors said he had perfect spitting aim, never missing a sand-filled box across his office.
I will commit many blunders, there can be no doubt, but I flatter myself they will be attributed to the head and not to the heart.
From the start, Taylor seemed to go out of his way to alienate fellow Whigs in Congress. He virtually ignored his own cabinet members. And determined to communicate with all political parties, he bypassed the established Whig press and set up his own administration newspaper. Taylor's presidency took place in an era when the Senate often overshadowed the executive branch of government. Just 12 years before the Civil War, the major issue of the day centered on the institution of slavery. By the Mexican War, the United States had gained vast new Western territories, including what would become the states of California and New Mexico. The issue now was whether they would become slave states or free. Everyone assumed that the slave-owning president would see to it that the institution of slavery got extended.
I was represented as a Southern slaveholder in favor of the extension of slavery and as a man who trafficked in human flesh.
But in his annual message sent to Congress, Taylor revealed that above all else, he was a confirmed Unionist and was in favor of the admission of the new states even if they first banned slavery. Southerners were stunned and called the president a turncoat. Speaking on behalf of his fellow Southern congressmen, an exasperated Alexander Stephens confronted Taylor in the White House and threatened secession if he didn't change his policy. The old general grew furious.
I informed him that if they were taken in rebellion against the Union, I would hang them with less reluctance than I had hung deserters and spies in Mexico.
With the country hurtling towards civil war, a national debate raged in Congress, attempting to find a compromise between North and South. But in the White House, Zachary Taylor dug in his heels, refusing to compromise with anyone.
I think there's something quite splendid about this general who looked at the issue purely in its own terms, came to conclusions opposed to his party's, and said, I'm president, and within my authority, nobody's going to push me around. I'm going to stay where I am. It's splendid, but it's not politics. It's great theater, but it's not governing. General Taylor was indulging himself, in my view.
Having served just 16 months in office, an exhausted President Taylor sat under a roasting sun for hours during a 4th of July celebration. Then, he downed large quantities of tainted milk and raw fruit and vegetables. Stricken by acute gastroenteritis, the invincible hero was confined to his bed, eating ice, taking quinine, being bled.
In 2 days, I shall be a dead man.
His condition, made worse by the efforts of his doctors, would lead to his death in less than a week. On July 9, 1850, Vice President Millard Fillmore prepared to assume office and inherit the unresolved crisis Taylor was leaving behind. And for one brief moment, the entire nation, both Northerners and Southerners, united in sorrow. It was a fitting tribute to the man who had stubbornly clung to his independence throughout a mounting political storm. His last words were to his family, grouped around his bed.
The storm in passing has swept away the trunk. I expect the summons soon. I regret nothing.
Presidents after Zachary Taylor returned to a more politically engaged style of leadership, epitomized by Abraham Lincoln. Not until 1876, the year of the nation's centennial, did there arise another president so determined as Adams and Taylor to go it alone. He was a Cincinnati politician named Rutherford B. Hayes.
The presidential mania makes mad every man who is at all prominent in Washington. It never seemed to me worth the cost of self-respect, of independence.
All his life, Hayes was hard-working, methodical, and impeccably honest. So pristine, James Garfield once said, no nickname can be pinned to him. He saw himself as nothing more than a nonpartisan public servant.
Rutherford B. Hayes was a man of great respectability, considerable approachability, not flashy. Rutherford Hayes is one of the least memorable individuals to occupy the White House. He was very much an idealist, I think. He had a strong sense of the independence of his office. John Adams was a hero of his.
Like Adams, Rutherford B. Hayes traced his lineage back almost to the Mayflower. His lifelong commitment was not to be intimidated by anything or anyone.
I discovered that my chiefest obstacles were in myself, that if I could master myself, all other difficulties would vanish.
At Harvard Law School, Hayes rose to the top of his class, and once back in Ohio, he became known as a lawyer of unquestioned integrity. In 1852, he married Lucy Webb and settled down to have 8 children and to lead what Hayes hoped would be a quiet and disciplined life. But on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter was attacked by South Carolina troops, and Hayes's orderly lifestyle came to an abrupt end.
My feelings were that this was a just and necessary war, and that I would prefer to go into it, even if I knew I was to be killed, than to live through and after it without taking any part in it.
Hayes rose rapidly through the ranks to brigadier general, and during the course of the war, he was wounded 5 times.
My first wound, a shell fragment hit the right knee. I feel it yet.
His leadership qualities got him noticed. When he was approached during the war to campaign for public office, Hayes exclaimed, "An officer who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped." Despite his objections, he was elected while still fighting in Virginia, and after the war served in Congress. He went on to be elected 3 times as governor of Ohio.
From the ocean to the ocean.
By 1876, state Republicans were pushing their favorite son towards the presidency, even though Hayes was, for the most part, unknown outside Ohio. One East Coast observer called him a third-rate nonentity.
I seem to be the second choice of many of the supporters of other candidates.
But at the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati, when other more prominent candidates failed to secure majorities, the delegates turned to Hayes.
I discouraged rather than encouraged the Hayes movement. But I shall show a grit that will astonish those who predict weakness.
Cheers for the red, white, and blue.
In November, Hayes's Democratic opponent, Samuel Tilden, narrowly won the popular vote. But the electoral count in 3 southern states was then called into question. The dispute was laid before an electoral commission. As party leaders argued and bargained, Hayes refused to make any political concessions. But after nearly 4 months of stalemate, Southern Democrats were secretly assured that if Hayes was named president, he would end Reconstruction and pull federal troops out of the South. With that assurance, it was announced that Hayes, not Tilden, was the country's 19th president. His political enemies labeled him Rutherford B. Hayes.
He took office under a terrible cloud, but vindicated himself personally by his rectitude at a time when rectitude was symbolically and practically important. He promptly kept his pledge, pulled the troops out. There simply wasn't majority support through the northern states and the northern political organizations any longer for ensuring the civil rights of the blacks, which is what this was basically all about.
Hayes's ending of Reconstruction came at a cost. Pledges he had received from Southern Democrats to protect the rights of black citizens proved worthless, and the civil rights revolution that Hayes had inherited would be stalled until the 20th century.
The Army was withdrawn from the South because I believed it a wise thing to do. I had to adhere to my own views.
From the start of his presidency, Hayes firmly established his independence and acted as he saw fit. Fellow Republicans were outraged at his choice of a cabinet, which included a Democrat, David M. Key, who had once been a Confederate officer.
It was the first time in our history that a gentleman who had opposed the election of a president was, by that president, invited into his cabinet. I was ready to risk my own standing and reputation with my party.
Hayes's independent views eventually pitted him against nearly every politician in Washington. He stood up to railroad companies, became an early environmentalist, and attacked the long-standing system of political patronage. In the 1870s, the New York Custom House was the center of national party politics. Responsible for collecting most of the revenue for the federal government, it had become rife with corruption. Hayes fired its top 3 officials, including the collector himself, future President Chester A. Arthur. And despite strong resistance by the Senate, he stood firm, ordering that no federal employee engage in any political activity.
The great success of my administration was in getting control of the New York Custom House and changing it from a political machine for the benefit of party leaders into a business office for the benefit of the public.
At the White House, Hayes was a diligent chief executive. A religious man who never missed his morning prayers, he met with callers every afternoon and often late into the night. Hayes had the first telephone installed in the White House and placed his first call to Alexander Graham Bell. And he became the first president to travel to the West Coast while in office. His greatest asset, he liked to say, was his wife, Lucy, who was the most esteemed president's wife since Dolly Madison. Nicknamed Lemonade Lucy for her barring of alcohol from White House functions, she was the first to be widely referred to as the First Lady.
Lucy's large, warm heart and lively sympathy for all around her have made her wonderfully popular.
Hayes found himself increasingly appreciated by the American public. His independent spirit, his hard-working habits, and his basic decency were refreshing in Washington.
I never had an overweening fondness for political life. My periods of public employment were merely parentheses in my private life.
Hayes had promised upon entering office that he would seek one term only, thus freeing him, he said, to be thoroughly independent in all his actions. When friends tried to convince him to run for a second term, he adamantly refused even to consider it.
Hayes managed to accomplish much of what he wanted. He made the Republican Party a great deal more respectable than it had been in the period after Grant. Within the limits of his own authority, Hayes tried to act as independently as Adams had done and as Taylor had contemplated doing. In some respects, Hayes was more effective than either. But I have to say that the formula, loner, idealist, whatever its defects as a formula for being president, it seems to be a great formula for being former president.
In retirement, Hayes became more active in social causes than any previous former president. He worked principally in the area of education, in particular on behalf of poor black children in the South. And he was conspicuous in the prison reform movement. Above all, he was glad no longer to be president.
It was my equanimity of temper which enabled me to bear the anxieties and vexations which have broken down so many of my predecessors. Now that I'm back where I belong, I mean to stay there. While I am not wealthy, I am happily independent.
Of all the presidents who came after Hayes, the man who most resembled his personal style was a Southern governor who hated politics as usual. In the aftermath of Watergate, he promised to bring a sense of decency back to the presidency. He was Jimmy Carter. Mr. President, you're being categorized here as a man of independent cast of mind. Is that a fair assessment of you?
Well, it's true. I was the first president in more than 125 years elected from the Deep South. I was a governor who had not been involved in any way in Washington. When we arrived at the White House, in what should have been a glorious reception, I remember the cartoons about me, insinuating that I had an IQ of about 50. They had a picture of my mother barefooted for outhouses with moons cut in the door, straw coming out of our ears. But I felt sometimes that I was an outsider, and I didn't want to be, but I think it was almost inherent in my background as a lonely Georgian farmer who was reaching out for personal support.
I think the country very much wanted to see an outsider, and Mr. Carter clearly perceived that was the stance that could get him the presidency. He was a man of great self-confidence. His entire political experience had been in the state of Georgia. Mr. Carter profited and suffered from being the smartest boy in the class. He was certainly the smartest youngster who had come out of Plains, Georgia, and clearly in terms of sheer intelligence, dominated that little community.
James Earl Carter Jr. was born into a peanut farming family in 1924. From his father, he acquired a lifelong belief in discipline and hard work. From his mother, he inherited a compassion for the poor and a commitment to civil rights.
We had a good life. We lived along with everyone else with no money and no electricity, no running water, hard work and things of that kind. Our family was run with the strictest possible discipline. I mean, there was no concept in my family of disobeying direct order of my father. If you had asked me when I was 5 years old or 8 years old, what do you want to be when you grow up? It was always, I want to go to Annapolis and be a naval officer. And until I was past 30 years old, my only ambition was to be a successful naval officer.
With a degree in nuclear engineering, Carter served in the Navy for 7 years. With his wife, Rosalind, he started a family, and they thrived on their independent life in the North, relieved to have left behind the small-town life of Plains, Georgia. But in 1953, Carter was forced to abruptly change careers and return to run the family peanut business. Was it hard to leave the service when your father died and
it was
to go back home?
It was one of the worst things that I have ever done. I prayed about it. I labored over it, and I was afraid to tell Rosalind that I was even considering it. When I finally told her that, it almost broke up our marriage. We have never had a more serious confrontation. When I finally resigned from the Navy, we had 3 little boys. We drove from Schenectady to New York, where I was working on a nuclear submarine, back to Plains. She hardly said a word to me on the way home. And for 6 months after we got back to Plains, she didn't cooperate in many ways. She was devastated. The first entire year I was home, Our income was less than $300. But we stuck it out, and I never have really had doubt that I had made the right decision in going back home.
Entering first local, then state politics, Carter built a reputation for strict honesty and idealism. But he also became known as a man who distanced himself from his colleagues. His 1966 bid for the governorship of Georgia failed in part because of his political isolation. In 1970, he ran for the governorship again, and this time he won. Then just 2 years later, he set his ambitions even higher.
I began to plan secretly to run for president. Only about 5 or 6 of us knew it. And then by the time I announced in 1974, nobody cared. And nobody thought I had a chance. But I was confident.
Jimmy Carter is running for what? I'm running for president. I want to wish you a nice day and ask you to help me. I'm running for president.
President?
Of the United States. My name is Jimmy Carter. I'm from Georgia. I'm going to be your next president.
You hope.
I hope. Yes, sir. That's what I'm here for. I hope to get you to help me.
There's Jimmy Carter here, our next president. Jimmy Carter for president. Jesus God Almighty.
We'll put me on the second of March. I'll try to do you a good job, and when I'm in the White House, I'll try to say good.
One of the characteristics that I have had is tenacity. Once I set my mind to something, it's hard to change my way or deter me.
When did you realize you'd won?
Well, it wasn't until the final returns came in from the state of Mississippi that I went over the top.
How'd you feel?
Exhilarated, tired, ambitious. I guess you might say it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me in a public way. I was immersed in a sense of history and responsibility and I would say humility that was surprising.
He was one of the most idealistic and determined men ever to reach the presidency, filled with positive ideas about what he wanted to accomplish. Personally disciplined, hard-working, and totally honest, he was a breath of fresh air in Washington. But he underestimated the political task that lay before him.
Mr. Carter came into office determined to tackle as many problems as he could, as fast as he could. And in a lot of respects, fell on his face as a consequence. Too many things, too hastily decided in too much isolation, put before Congress and the country in rapid profusion. If you want to do things in the presidency, if you want to advance disarmament, if you want to altogether alter our energy policy, if you want to bring a national health care system into being and so forth, and he wanted all those things, many others. If you want those things, you have to develop coalitions, not only in Congress, but of the interests outside of Congress and of public opinion to bear on Congress. And that is your essential business. There's no escaping it.
But Jimmy Carter was not interested in the traditional political process. His passionate do-it-yourself approach to new legislation often failed to gain congressional support. Eventually, he did manage to push through a series of major energy bills, but over time, his political independence confused just about everyone.
There were a lot of articles written, permeated by consternation about how do you put this President Carter in a box? How do you define him? Is he liberal? Is he conservative? Is he a warrior? Is he a peacemaker? Is he too idealistic? Is he too pragmatic? But I never did try to create that confusion. My comprehension of myself was fairly complete, I guess. I never lost an hour of sleep while I was president, worrying about what had happened or what might happen and so forth. I did the best I could. And with my self-confidence and my religious faith, I accommodated disappointments and really enjoyed being president. I think the best time was probably dealing with the Middle East issue. I made a very difficult decision over the almost unanimous opposition of my cabinet and my staff to take the initiative and to go to Egypt and to go to Israel to try to get Begin and Sadat to agree on a peace treaty. And when they did sign, both of them signed the agreement. I guess that was probably my best moment.
He put enormous effort and intensity, sense of purpose, decisiveness, concern, even subtlety into bringing the Egyptians and the Israelis together. It was a brilliant piece of personal work. Let me put it this way. It showed him as the best Secretary of State we've ever had as president. But that attention to detail, that careful pursuit of it, left all kinds of other things unattended to at the time, including the deteriorating regime in Iran, and for that, he was to pay a terrible price.
There was a time of great stress for me, and that's while the hostages were being held, when I was obsessed with preserving their lives and bringing them back home safely. I would meet personally with the families of the hostages and try to reassure them of my interest. So that was a very bad time.
That was your worst moment.
Oh, yes, it was.
Jimmy Carter's presidency was undone by the hostage crisis in Iran, by an oil crisis, and by soaring inflation. But perhaps more than anything else, it was undone by his own independent-mindedness and his unwillingness to engage in party politics.
Well, I have to admit, not very proudly, that I didn't ever put party loyalty at a very high level in my list of priorities. As a matter of fact, I had more political trouble with the liberal Democrats than I did with the Republicans. Even when I got the renomination in 1980, it was after a bitter battle with Ted Kennedy and his supporters, and he almost refused even to shake hands with me on the platform of the Democratic Party. And we never did heal those wounds within the party. Because I think in many ways, I'm not trying to brag, but maybe this come across, I didn't really put re-election as a high priority. I've talked to a number of former presidents. All of us agree that there should be one 6-year term.
Really?
Yes.
Get,
I think if you check with the others, you'll find there's a consensus there.
Yes. Did the presidency change you?
I don't think so. I don't think it changed me much. And it's hard for me to answer that, but the people who know me best, my wife and my close associates, don't think it did.
You leave the White House. You lose. You once said, show me a good loser and I'll show you a loser. A tough time.
It was a very difficult time, and it would have been more difficult for me if it hadn't been even more difficult for Rosalind. And the fact that I went back to Plains, where my family and Rosalind's family have been for 150 years, and where our farm was, and our church was, and our friends were, was a haven within which I was able to heal my disappointment very quickly.
In retirement, Carter, like Rutherford B. Hayes, became an active humanitarian working on charitable ventures and helping to resolve international conflicts. His basic decency had survived his years as president, and he became widely admired across America and around the world.
I went to the White House with my own ideas about what ought to be done. And I never did fit in, really, with the Washington environment much. But I think that I did have an independent set of mind.
Our public attitudes to the presidency are a grab bag of mutually contradictory notions. The American public, from time to time, wishes to see the trustee who looks neither to right nor to left, but only up to the heavens and down to the work before him. The man of independence. It is not, however, in my judgment, a good formula for doing what presidents have to do. So I sympathize with these idealists. I hope we don't have too many of them. And I think the country would be better off if we took that element out of our grab bag of beliefs and gently laid it to rest.
To be truly effective in the presidency, one cannot, in the end, ignore the importance of politics. And the proof lies in the simple fact that not one of our most independent-minded presidents has been elected to a second term. And yet the promise of independent leadership, of those who will put the national interest above partisan politics, survives. And the model of an independent executive can set an example for every president to chart his own moral course.